Hello, and here we are looking at Chapter 7, The Middle Years of Family and the Not-So-Empty Nest. Now, as a life stage, middle age is relatively new. It's not something that's been a part of Canadian society forever. It's relatively new. The current trend towards smaller families means that parents are finished with child rearing earlier than they had been in the past. Smaller families, fewer children, starting a little later, finishing a little later, smaller families. Since life expectancy is also increasing, is getting quite a bit longer than what it used to be, most adults can look forward to many years without children in the home. Thus the empty nest syndrome. There are numbers of questions that need to be considered. What factors influence families in this stage of life? And we can look at a number of things, and we will. Current life, midlife generation, the baby boomers. In 2011, these were people from 1949, 1946, I think it is, to 1965. So they'd be about 45 to 65 years old. There's nearly 4.39 million, which is slightly more than people the ages of 15 and 24, which is at about 4.37 million. The median age of Canadian population is 39.9 years old. And it's expected to rise to about 44% as baby boomers start to age and get into retirement age. We'll see the general median age of Canadian population get older. So baby boom cohort has a profound impact on Canadian society. Never before have so many people been so close to retirement. So the impact on the Canadian government, the old age security pension plans and other pension plans in place means a lot of people are going to be retiring and looking for access to money. So let's look at what the middle years is about in the family and the empty nest syndrome. So what you're seeing here is the population by select age group. 1991, 2001, 2011, 2021. Of course, 2021 is a projection. And you'll find this in your textbook, and it shows the number of two age groups and the proportion of each group in Canadian population over a 30-year period. The number of Canadians aged 45 to 64 will nearly double between 1991 and 2021. This group already has accounted for over 1/4 of all Canadians in 2011. So it just shows that the population getting older is going to, this sort of midlife period is going to take on a new sort of importance in regards to family. And so when we look at the middle years, have now joined child rearing as the longest stage in life. Midlife group is diverse. It can include first-time parents as well as great-grandparents. Some begin midlife at peak of career or nearly retirement. These years of family life cycle are what's known as transitional. The period often marks splitting of one family into two or more as children leave family of origin and form their own nuclear families of procreation. So this sort of moving of children who are getting older out of your own family home and starting families of their own. It's very transitional because not all children leave at the same time. The ages of your children will vary, and when they leave will vary, and when they leave home. So this is a very transitional period of life for middle-aged people. Now, in this sort of period, we could look at things that are known as stressors. Now, stressors are life events that can produce changes in the family system. Now, family adaptations in the middle years contains a series of stressors. You have, the beginning of parenthood in some cases. You have the onset of death for some. Health concerns of a spouse start to materialize, and the success of children, or the failure of children. These are all stressors in varying degrees, starting school at a post-secondary level. There's a lot of stressors that families deal with and cope with throughout this period of time in life. Now, in the parent generation at midlife, Erik Erikson, who did a fair bit of work on looking at moral development and parental, stages of development, talked about individuals typically consider whether their lives, especially the work and family lives, have been fulfilling. And this time of midlife is when people start to get this perspective. Midlife occurs when children are transitioning from independence to parents near retirement. Now, the term generativity is the focus on one's legacy. So Erickson here stated that the key issue in middle age is having children passing on something of value to the younger generation. So rather than be focusing on one's own success as a parent, you're looking at what you can pass on and to your children and your legacy. Now, generativity takes on various forms. You could have, and raising children to adulthood is something that's very important to this sort of legacy, raising your children to adulthood. Mentoring a relative or a young person. For some, this takes the form of creation of artistic works. They start to explore their creative side. Since they have more time, they're not raising children, they can explore artistic work or working to better the community through advocacy and volunteerism. It can also take the form of committing to family leisure time and transmit family history and values. And so this experience of generativity can be both very rewarding, but can be a problem for those whose families aren't transitioning through this very well. As men's and women's social roles become similar, women will experience roots to generativity more closely resembling men's. In the past, most research focused on the men's experience. Career and public life seen the most important forms of generativity. Assumed women express generativity through less esteemed functions of having and raising children. And the baby boom generation is perhaps the first where the majority of women have been encouraged to develop separate identities. And some of the impact of that is that many young people today are forming their own independent identities, men and women both, and that hasn't been something that was a part of all history with families. So when we consider the parent generation at midlife, there's a term that you're probably familiar with that is called the midlife crisis. And with the recent popularity of, bucket lists, things that you want to do before you kick the bucket, it reflects on a number of the growing number of individuals in this age group who want to do, what are the things I've got to do before I die? The long age span divided into two periods. You have more of an evaluation period and a transition period. The early 40s and the late 50s is more this sort of, feel this liberation, experimentation, and innovation. The late 50s, this will carry on to the late 70s. So the midlife crisis is an extreme strain on a person's reevaluation of his or her own life in the middle years. What's the meaning of life, and have I accomplished things in my life? So the midlife crisis is this sort of transition time of, have I accomplished what it is that I aim to, and have I met some of these expectations, and what's left to be done, and will I have time to do it? So the midlife crisis is somewhat a real experience, although it takes a fair bit of a comical twist in regards to media. What representations of early middle age are represented in the trailers for films like This Is 40 and Date Night? What representations of the elderly are represented in trailer films? Well, you look at the bucket list and you get an idea of the kinds of issues that people, as they get older and get into this midlife time, start to experience. Now, I've mentioned in the title of the chapter, as is mentioned, is the empty nest syndrome. Homemakers, particularly mothers, are sometimes described as suffering the empty nest syndrome, a depressed state, and a sense of uselessness when the last child leaves home. And in fact, the empty nest often brings a couple increased happiness and marital satisfaction. Middle-aged people experiencing a sense of confidence and competence, particularly in their jobs, and start to become more exploratory in what else they can do with their life now that their primary role that has been there for some 25 years of raising children is no longer at the forefront of their responsibility. Children are growing up, adults looking after themselves and carrying on in their own lives. And so this empty nest syndrome is maybe something that was more a part of our history than it is about our current state, although I'm sure we all know people who are lamenting the loss of their children moving out of the house and are at a loss of what to do and can't redefine their role. Because this is who I've been and who I've identified myself as being, and then children leaving leaves a hole in people's lives, and that is what has typically been the empty nest syndrome. Now, in this generation of midlife, we start to have this growing sense of mortality, the death of parents and people of their own age. Now, you may not be as aware, but if you've been watching in the news, you've been hearing of the death of different artists, Glenn Frey, David Bowie. Now, in my generation, these were popular musicians and people that we've known and listened to for 30 and 40 years. And so when you see the death of these are people in your own sort of age group, maybe a little older, and it starts to you become more aware of your own mortality. So your own physical aging, becoming of grandparents. In spite of these minor complaints, most older people are still feeling fairly vigorous, and particularly how this shifts and changes over the years. You know, that generations ago, to be 60 was to be old age. Well, in today's world, to be 70 and 80 is not atypical. And more elderly people, more older citizens, are healthier than they've ever been. Women do not regard menopause as a major crisis anymore. They see this as a transition, a stage of life, but it is part of what is a part of that stage of life. You go through it. Both sexes seem more likely to worry about health and physical appearance, especially when over 50. Now, the parent generation, we look at this sort of midlife. Many individuals want something different from life. Experience both a push towards excitement and a pull towards security. These sort of want to do some new things and want to make sure that you have the foundation of support and security financially to do those new things. Women hoping to return to a career they had before they had children, and problems such as what's called the mummy track. The mummy track is limits to traditional female roles, either because of there is more flexibility for childcare, or opportunities are less accessible because we're rebuilding. There's a disconnect for some moms in that area. A sizable minority of middle-aged adults do not reach their financial or work-life goals. And so this puts this midlife crisis again into a difficult spot. So most baby boomers involved in relationships with children and parents at the same time. It's also known as the sandwich generation. A growing number are raising grandchildren, many not prepared for the second parenthood. Greater life expectancy makes relationships more complex. Romances, friendships, sibling ties. Boomers report relationships with family and friends to be the most satisfying parts of their life. Now, this next section is something that some younger people whose parents are older find surprising. That couples who stay together may have to renegotiate some aspect of their relationship. As they adjust to the childless household, couples often shift towards greater androgyny, or balance between masculine and feminine. Middle-aged parents with teens at home are more likely to be depressed than those with older children. Many couples report more satisfaction in marriages in midlife. Sexual relationship of couples may change. For some, the interest in sex increases. For some, the interest drops off through boredom, and some accept the stereotype that older people are just asexual beings. Aging and sexuality experienced differently by sex in North America. Men's sexual attractiveness is linked to success, often increases with age. Women's is linked to youthful physical appearance and tends to decline with age. Men get gray hair and it seems somehow is distinguished. Women get gray hair and they have to color it. Now we're seeing more and more shifts where women aren't choosing to color the hair. They're just fully embracing who they are, and they have greater acceptance for themselves than maybe women did in the past. Greater acceptance now of sexuality and less opposition to sex for unmarried people. The reality is unsurprising, given that this generation ushered in the sexual revolution of the 60s. Men are more likely than women to try a variety of sex-related activities, Gay men are the most likely to be sexually active. Those with regular sexual partners are more satisfied sexually and generally more positive about life than those that are non-partnered. When adults over 50 look for new partners, they increasingly turn to the internet dating sites. It's the fastest growing group of clientele. Men wanted committed relationships. Women look for companionship without the prospect of heavy caregiving. Both sexes stress their youthfulness either in appearance or in activity. And so the older person is enjoying a much more active and full life in old age than they've ever done in the past. So let's finish up this part 1, and then we'll jump into part 2, looking at the adolescence and the approach to moving into adulthood within the family. All right, good luck.